Food is central to our lives. Every day, we consume such a variety of food that we almost take it for granted. Biologically, there is no way of avoiding it, so it is important to look at where food comes from. How many times have you actually noticed someone eating or drinking in a movie or book? It's an action that we often overlook, so when food is mentioned as often as it is in the Canterbury Tales, we have to take note. It gives the characters more dimension, and we'll be looking into the significance of foods such as bread, wine, ale, meats, poultry, fish, and spices. As talked about in class, the diets of each social class varied greatly, and much more dramatically between the peasants and the upper classes, the clergy and the nobles. However, there were staple foods that everyone shared in common, but what differed was the quality of these foods. These are referred to as staple foods, and changes in the supply of these goods affected every citizen. The two most common staple foods were bread and wine. Bread was the most commonly consumed food, as grain, barley, and wheat were the most abundant crops in Europe at the time. These are starches, which are much more hardy than other vegetables, so peasants could survive on bread alone. Bread was so important that laws were passed to regulate the production and sale of it, called the assize of bread. For drink, wine was more popular than water, and there were different types of wine for different parts of the day. Sometimes it was watered down, but not entirely, so drinking a lot of wine would not always result in intoxication. More often it was just spiced for different meals. They also had different ales for different purposes, such as porter and stouts for nutritional value. There is one more important component to the medieval diet, and that's spices. We can't say these were a staple food because not everyone had them, and those who did were seen as higher up in their social class. A peasant who had saffron was unimaginable. Saffron is actually still pricey today, around $1,800 for a pound. But a peasant who had a spice like paprika was seen as pretty well off, and would likely be part of the rising middle class of Chaucer's time. The basic spice is black pepper, used by all social classes if you could afford it, but less commonly the higher in social class you look, because they had more variety. Spices were so significant that the sale of anise, cubeb, and licorice actually funded repairs of the London Bridge. Pepper could have also been used to pay rent, and occasionally it was actually required by the landlord. The most important use for spices wasn't as it is today, to enhance flavors, but rather to mask spoiled foods, so essentially hiding bad flavors. The necessity to mask the off flavors of spoiled foods was routine for the lower classes, as very few preservation techniques were available to anyone at the time, let alone the poor. Typically, meats and such were salted to preserve it for as long as possible. Some other uses of spices include being the essence of personal luxury and an important part of public functions, banquets, and parties. Spices were used in perfumes, especially cardamom, cassia, cinnamon, and sweet marjoram seeds for their sweet aromas. Some common aphrodisiacs were anise, basil, fennel leaves, coriander, and garlic. Spice-scented oils were used to soothe the skin, and as aforementioned, wines were commonly flavored with spices. It also had medicinal uses, as spices were used to heal the sick and wounded. Now you can see why costly spices were the most desirable gifts. In one monastery, Marjorie Jenkins writes about the culinary utilization of spices and their medicinal uses by monks. The most common spices for them, members of the clergy and the upper class, were ginger, pepper, nutmeg, mace, cloves, and interestingly enough, saffron. In the years right after Chaucer's death began the Age of Discovery. At this time, the Indian spice trade flourished across both the Silk Road and the maritime trade routes that connected Europe with Asia. Exotic spices such as clove, nutmeg, and mace were brought over. Mace was 4 shillings and 7 pence, quite expensive for the time. Ginger was 1 shilling, and cumin was 2 pence. Though Chaucer could not have written about this new age of spices with more availability and more variety, readers of his work would have been living in such a moment of spice splendor. Thus, his integration and highlighting of the importance of spices made all the difference on the impact of the reader. Now that we know what the early medieval diet consisted of, we can talk about what it lacked. Bluntly, there wasn't much of anything else for the peasants. Having a different meal for dinner every day was rare, and usually reserved for the upper classes. A peasant's diet consisted of bread, some vegetables, and usually some sort of broth or soup that consisted of whatever food items were available and were boiled together. We can see the implications of this in the Franklin's prologue, because although he was well off, he does not hold a title and still belongs to the middle class. Yet he was able to achieve such a variety of foods that Tiff will talk about in a little bit. In terms of the future, this expansion of foods is what extended the life expectancy rates of both men and women as their vitamin and mineral consumptions increased. Numerically, this progress in food can be shown through these statistics, and food allowances in 1424 included 40% bread, 4% oats, 23% malt, 23% meat, 3% fish, and 7% dairy. In class, I'll have some graphs to visually show you just how many times these categories of food appeared in the Canterbury Tales.
There is so much more to food than simply ingredients, recipes, and palatable flavors. Cultural, societal, and religious aspects play a huge role in the ways of which food affects not only literature, but the lives of various groups since the beginning of time. The importance of dinners has been prevalent since the early 14th century, when in England, the Acton Manor House of Alice de Brienne served 16,500 meals over the span of 1 year. People eating with Alice were not just social guests, but members of the family, workers on the estate, and members of the church. These daily dinners were said to have reinforced this sense of mutual dependency and the idea that food was the tie that bound all of these groups of people together. Just as families have daily dinners today, this added to the main theme of how food has been affecting the lives of various societies and cultures from the beginning of time until now. An abundance of traditions and common habits, as simple as table etiquette, have evolved from dinner tables across the globe. Through these images, it is obvious that all societies and cultural groups have taken pride in their diverse backgrounds and families, and they are able to portray their appreciation through a family dinner. Students have seen that it was as early as the Neolithic period that eating gradually became a key element of group structure, a mark of identity, and a symbolic means of expressing thought. By the time of the Second Dynasty in Egypt, it became possible to talk about types of food, methods of preparation, banquets, dining rooms, kitchen help, and the relationship between social groups and food. In some of Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's fictional works, food is described as a metaphor for illustrating human conflicts in modern life between sexes, generations, and the social classes. Another professional, Massimo Montanari, one of the leading world experts in food history and culture, has said that food is a physical property and a social symbol that both divides and unites. Eating together and preparing foods in special ways has separated groups, distinguishing them from others in their own society and from those beyond. In studies of the Greek Symposium, it was shown that part of the evening that followed eating brought together the political and military elite for the entertainment and for serious intellectual and political activities. It was through events, such as public banquets, that different social groups were integrated through celebrations and feasting. From a religious perspective, the early Hebrews were forbidden from eating animals that did not have cloven hooves and did not chew their cud. This helped to bind several Semitic tribes into a unified group, separating them from other tribes, which also portrayed separations caused by religious influence on food. There was also the Christian practice of receiving the Eucharist, which is known to be the body and blood of the Son of God in the form of bread and wine. This tradition came from the Last Supper, which was a feast Jesus held for him and his disciples, where he shared with them bread and wine right before his crucifixion. The story of the Last Supper became a very well-known story that was shared all over the world, and it influenced a variety of people, especially artists and writers. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Church made it mandatory for Christians to fast on certain days, as well as receive the Eucharist at least once a year. In terms of gender, meat consumption was generally associated with males, while vegetables were usually consumed by females. This portrayed the idea that females were patient and abstemious, while males were seen as more aggressive and controlling through their consumption of foods like meat and fowl. The family meal also led to the central role of the woman in the household to manage the meal, and through the meal to ensure the strength of the family, which has clearly had an influence on later generations, leading to the formation of common social stereotypes. Throughout Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, feasts were a huge aspect of many of the stories, such as the Knight's Tale and the Franklin's General Prologue, where dinners and social gatherings represented a higher form of manners, allowing the audience to view these characters with much respect. Have you ever wondered why Chaucer has chosen certain foods throughout his tales? While in the Franklin's General Prologue, the food discussed tie together to give the reader a much better understanding of the Franklin, adding to his portrait. Being that the Franklin is old, and Hippocrates says that old men are naturally moist, soft, and cold, to preserve his good health, he should have an abundance of firm, dry food. The Franklin keeps a supply of the food that is best for him. He has it prepared in the most helpful manner, and he has cultivated a taste for the highly desirable, sharp, and poignant seasoning. Can you relate the foods mentioned in the Franklin's General Prologue to this main idea? Gender becomes a huge part of Chaucer during an abundance of tales. We will see how the types of foods used in the women's stories differ greatly from the foods used in the men's tales, and what this says about how genders were viewed during Chaucer's time.
During the Middle Ages, one's social class was everything in life. Class defined who you were, and there was little change that you can make. The breakdown was rather simple. Upper class was made up of nobles and lords and some knights. Middle class was made up of some knights, merchants, craftsmen, and farm owners, and the lower class was made up of peasants and serfs. A main source of information used by historians to tell the breakdown of class was food. The food that one ate varied by class, and this variety of diet is truly represented in various studies, and especially in Chaucer's writing. The clearest representation of the variety of food in the Canterbury Tales is in the prologue. Food is discussed character after character, and it is through this representation that we can extract an idea of the food's relation to class in Chaucer. As seen in the difference between the franklin and the cook, food varies slightly. The franklin is a wealthy farm owner that is on the border of the upper and middle class. He makes bountiful feasts of fine bread and ale, meat and fish, fat partridges, and many a bream and pike. He was an esteemed member of the community, whereas the cook was just part of the guildsman's clan. The guildsmen were deep in the middle class, and the difference between them and the franklin is astounding. The cook is used by the guildsmen clearly as an attempt to seem higher up in class. However, while the cook makes good food, he has to use sharp flavoring powder and spice for savor in order to make the food taste good. The franklin has good quality food to start, with animals alive and ready to be eaten in his backyard. The cook, however, starts with mediocre quality and uses these fancy techniques to bring the food to par. With the topic of spices being addressed, spices were a very interesting part of the medieval lifestyle. Having just gained access to the Silk Road, Europe during this time began getting more exposure to spices. Spices had many different uses in the medicinal field, as well as in the culinary field. Monks used spices to create herbal remedies, but food, however, is going to be our focus. Spices had two main functions in food, and these functions are rather polar. Spices could be used as a luxury to enhance foods, or they could be used to cover up the flavor of bad meat. Spices being used as a luxury for the upper class could be found by the quote, "He hath no pepper." This phrase was used during Chaucer's era to describe a person that had nothing to his name. By stating that a person does not have the possession of pepper, a luxurious spice of the time, one implies that the person does not have the money to buy pepper, and further that the person has no money to his name. The price of pepper during this time was about equal per pound to the price of sheep. In addition, pepper was used in some cases as a form of bartering, in buying and selling houses and property. Spices were even taxed so heavily during this time that a portion of the construction of the London Bridge was funded by spice sales. The other end of the spectrum of spices is the use to mask the flavor of rotting meat. After autumn, the price of meat went down because farmers would have to kill most of their animals due to lack of feed over the winter. The meat was then preserved with salt, and the flavor was masked with a large amount of spices. In this case, spices were more of a lower class good. With that being said, the franklin, serving food to the upper class, served spices as a luxury to enhance food, whereas the cook, serving the guildsmen on the road, would use spices to mask the flavors of his preserved meat. Another food that represents social structure is bread. By analyzing the records of food allotted to workers on a farm, historians were able to distinguish the eating habits of people in the Middle Ages. In the year 1256, workers' diets were made up of about 74% bread. This is a significant percent of food intake. During this era, bread was made up of usually barley and rye, giving the bread a very gritty texture. In the year 1424, however, workers were given only 40% bread. This drastic change is due to the increase of the growth of wheat. Wheat bread had a fluffy texture like the bread we eat today, making it much more appealing to consumers in the upper class. In the Canterbury Tales, the nun was stated to have fed her dogs with wheat bread, due to the fact that she was a true lover of the finer things of life. Unlike the dogs, however, little was given to the workers on the farm due to the high profit that could be turned from wheat. Historians have gone so far as to relate food to social class by analyzing death rate. The upper class, well nourished and feasted well, had a death rate of 30.9 people per thousand. The lower class, however, had 47.3 people per thousand. That's a 1.6% increase just by food consumption. As you can tell, it is clear that food makes a huge impact on the way we live. From culture to gender, lower class to upper class, and from the Middle Ages all the way to today, food plays a large role on the lives we live. In the Canterbury Tales, characters are so hugely affected by food during this time, and by realizing this, it can help us see how the food we eat today came to be. History is just a large timeline of causes and effects, and the happenings of the Middle Ages could be the cause of so many things that happen today. We will talk more about this with you on Monday. See you in class.